Hello everyone, today we talk about the evangelization of the Germanic people, and not only broadly meant evangelization of Europe in the early Middle Ages. As you know, we already made multiple videos on this topic. You can find a bit of this in the medieval Christianity or in the Germanic history playlist and else. So medieval Scandinavia, I mean, they're scattered there. And we have already observed chiefly, how the thing happened. Even if anything, from a political point of view, a military point of view, we made a video about the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, for example, but also one of what was the largely pacific process of evangelization and spontaneous and actually rather fast process of evangelization among especially the Norse, by some degree, that we'll look at better today, considering the difference between properly, what it was meant by faith in a monotheistic sense and the ritual customs of the Germanic peoples, and stressing mostly the syncresis, of course, that took place, but also the general path, let's say, of development that it's not just a prerogative of this historical scenario, but it is more broadly how we should really describe the same process of acculturation in many other contexts, and still the permanence of the same beliefs, at some point even of the same fides, at least paganly meant, that the boundaries of which cannot really even be distinguished so easily from a more regulatory system like the monotheistic one, that however still has a specific moral substance that was the same one of the pagan world, because it had emerged from the same, right? It was just kind of perfecting toward another direction, and more than else adapting to the general modernization and secularization of the world, which is something that began since ever, right? It's a process that is still going on. At least, it can go back and forth, and this is actually a context where this is evident, because this long path towards a different concept of the use of force, which is what we look at today, is a path full of obstacles, right? Not free from relapses in ancestral violence, for example. But let's say to simply narrow it down to, let's say, well, this is mostly just something that happened in this specific Germanic or Norse context, as from the steppe or the forest tribesmen, let's say, to the medieval knight, right? Even just in this, within the frame of this temporal framework, let's say, kind of diminishes the larger scale of the process, literally from prehistory to today, really, as the medieval knight itself, it was not really born, if not by very narrow categorical criteria, as the way we usually do, right? The idea that there's a knight properly that is born, and in those decades, last decades of the 12th century, in the way we intend, also chivalry and so on, as a codified system. But as a matter of fact, this is a grave, almost hallucination due to a perspective distortion, right? Because not only knights already existed, but also the same religious military principles that were at the root of all the cultures of the time lived on. And we can't even say that we don't have them today, because by a certain degree they're fundamentally universal. And so that's mostly where my channel is heading as a broader interpretation. In fact, as you understand also from some videos I made recently, I'm really expanding fast that horizon, let's say, to start talking about this more specifically. It's however undeniable that, as we explained many times, that the conversion of the Germanic peoples of the Norse is an exception in history, in a strictly documentary sense, meaning that quite rarely, I don't know any other process like this in the world, which again happened every single where, Europe included, etc., that, however, was documented in the way we had the lack of having in the West in the first place, right? Because these peoples that were still close to civilization, to the point of the latter, not just being able to document them, but actually being so close to them in many ways to actually understand still part of their values, and seeing there the part even the juxtaposition of the same, right? What is Latin Germanic Europe in this sense at the moment of Christianization? Something complex, yes, but at the same time, it's something very that let's say knows itself, is aware of itself, and is basically extremely similar in many ways, in all its parts, and blended in, especially at this point. And so that's why we can have this view in the first place. So it's also a mistake in this sense to consider this phenomenon as a simple transition from a human type who conceives violence as the only basic form of life to another type which professes the martial art, subjecting it to an ethical religious system of values, right? Because in both there is a specific metaphysical Weltanschauung, and at the same time some form of codification, right? Even in those contexts where they were not literate, that didn't leave us, in fact, much of that evidence. About some of these peoples, we don't even fundamentally know their mythology. Think about the Franks and the impact that they had historically in Western Europe. We don't know anything about their mythology. Like, we understand that, of course, it was part of the broader, what we call the Germanic one, and so on. But and there is no mystery behind that, of course. But in like, we don't know their voice. We know practically nothing. There is nothing left of it specifically, and so from the Frankish side. So this gives you an idea, of course, of how much, in a sense, we give for granted just because, fortunately, we are informed about certain contexts, but how much, and how similar such beliefs, in a sense, were. Because a posteriori, let's say, we can still see among the peoples that were documenting these others that sometimes were literally almost the same. I mean, think about Adam of Bremen, or there's plenty of Paul the Deacon, for example, right? These were all peoples that were essentially describing a system. Adam of Bremen, most famously, the external one of the Saxons. Paul the Deacon was just writing a history of the Lombards, let's say, but they were acting as, from a ecclesiastical perspective, let's say, to describe something that was felt to be out of their realm, but fundamentally they were stemming from the same cultural background, and they probably knew even more than what they tried. They're not talking about these stories as fairy tales, or maybe they deal with them as such, but perfectly knowing and even betraying that view, the fact that there was actually an important meaning behind them that they knew, and they were actually telling you in a way or another. And not because there was much of a propaganda made, but because the world where they live in now had changed, and of course required another level of, let's say, discipline of the force, but at the same time was just along this universal path of improvement. And so that's something that we should see in oppositional terms, and this is in fact what historiography nowadays is really studying the stuff like. Now, in the news of conversions of the barbaric peoples that we have, the endeatic element of strength and victory often returns, right? You know that glory to Christ winner. I mean, this is the foundation of Christianity in the first place. So the idea of victory, even here, what is it really? Too much we separate. In fact, the idea, let's say, Christianity from paganism, as if these two things had nothing in common. This is a gross mistake. Like, it's probably one of the greatest ones you can make in a strictly religious historical point of view. They obviously emerged from essentially from a past, the universal values of which were shared, right? And that's why I care about the idea of force and how this was disciplined, because at the end of the day, this is the civilizational principles that made the difference. Christian and pagan values were not that distant. The symbols were basically all the same, and they were shared, and that's why this context is particularly useful to observe that. It's obvious, though, that politics and society were changing, because, I don't know, the Germanic peoples of the 6th century that were already, formally or superficially Christian, even if Aryan mostly, but they were something very different as confederacies or kingdoms from, I don't know, the Augustan tribes, as they were different. The 10th century post-Carolingian kingdoms were something very different from the 6th century ones. You know that also in the Viking era, there's a big difference between 8th and 10th century Scandinavia, and most of this process, this process substantiates, in fact, in a sort of collective discipline that, as you know, is not a way to weaken these communities, but actually to improve dramatically their political and military capacity, as it's quite evident in all these times and places. So the idea of connecting, of course, strength and victory to the new religion was not even properly a choice at some point. It came simply naturally, right? Maybe at the highest theological level there were some debates regarding to this, but I wouldn't banalize, of course, certain cultural choices that were made. We will keep talking about the great works of figures like Gregory the Great, and probably the enormous work of civilization that the church made at this point to integrate properly the military force of these people into towards a civilized direction, with all the real accomplishments of the case. But the concept at the root is, of course, that there are differences between monotheism and what we call paganism, or polytheism, which probably are all three are not accurate terms anymore to define what those religious realities were. But let's say the important thing to understand is that they were quite not, the boundaries were often overlapping. So the message was simple, after all, that we rely on the Christian God because it is the God who wins, right? Or at least who protects from the enemies. This is at least the ultimate hypocrisy of some cultural context where Christianity had taken a quite disturbing pacifistic direction, which was something that was somewhat intrinsic within the evangelic message, at least in the form of a pacific attitude that naturally was in sharp contrast with the most radically violent standard ethics of certain Germanic realities. So the differences here are important, but at the same time there is even not here like a categorical boundary, right? Christianity is not a pacifistic religion. It's never been. It's never meant to be. The language of the Gospels is actually quite violent, and it must be. And that's exactly where, in fact, the great work of acculturation was worked out here between the Christians and the pagans, included strongly these messages to actually show that Christianity has nothing to do, as a matter of fact, with the lack of violence. And it had never quite been the case, right? There had never been among Christian societies like a lack of military capacity due to Christianization per se, right? The historian Socrates, not the philosopher, is a later author, narrates that this example that the Burgundians living east of the Rhine, so we're talking at the time between the Rhine, the Main, and the Neckar rivers. So before they were eventually, as you know, deported by the Romans in eventually where the kingdom was established in Sepaudia and those areas in southern Gaul. Being desperate for the continuous violence that they were subjected to by the Huns, embraced the Christian faith because they were certain that the new god would help those who feared him. And the results, in fact, were not long in coming. The leader of the Huns immediately died of an atrocious and petty death, according to the biblical scheme of the end of the Rex Injustus, so the unjust king, spread by the De Mortibus Persecutorum, so the deaths of the persecutors, and later also a handful of Burgundians defeated a number of Huns 3 times greater, which also has some Nibelungic echo. And you know the story of the Burgundians. We made videos about them, and we'll come back on them hopefully soon at some point, because they're quite interesting people. They were not among the most powerful Germanic peoples. They had probably suffered important defeats when they were still in Central Europe, and so when they eventually settled on the Rhine, they kind of, they maintained this kind of quite, as every people at the time, they would keep an eye on the evolution of the international situation, but were often exposed. And the fact that they were here in between, because the Rhine was fundamentally the boundary between the Roman-dominated and the Hunnic dominated world, and the Germans that were living across it were, as you know, eventually taking sides. Well, the Huns were quite ambiguous. That's why eventually, in fact, the Burgundians were quite ambiguous. In fact, that's why they were eventually taken out by the Romans and deported. And showing even in there that they weren't this enormous power that in fact remained somewhat confined in the southern mountains and so on. An important position, but never like a power like the Franks or the Alemanni in the area. But as you know, they also left quite because of their tragedy and the fact probably that they had probably fought like, that the World Nibelungen lead there talks about the massacre in Vienna at the hand of the Huns, but all these names are, they may actually be referring to the Romans, the fact how they had ended, in fact, at that point, not in Vienna, by the way, but still there is much of that almost topic meaning that the Burgundians properly here were described for by Socrates, showing in this case that they had, in virtue of this fear of the Huns, were even stronger than them, would have just adopted Christianity, which is, this is just an anecdote, and but it is not to be discarded properly as an idea of what, how, and why not just the Germans, but basically any other people at that point would adopt Christianity in a sense, and the reasons being that not just the Roman Empire, so the greatest power around, was Christian, so that meant something for all these peoples that fundamentally lived within the orbit of the empire in a way or another, and were quite aware of that, like the same Burgundian example shows, but that also could be in this sense comparticipated, because it would have been kind of like the universal God, which these people, contrarily to the theistic invention that it would have been polytheistic, which is actually just a modernistic idea. It was not believed at the time, nor by the Christians, nor by the pagans. So what was the difference? This is the actual point that I'm making. It's not it's more than a provocation. Would necessarily identify as the God, right, of the skies. That is essentially what all the Indo-Europeans and other people believed everywhere, and had always believed and kept believing, right? That had always been a God, a single God, even for the pagans, because that was the one of the skies. At least properly, I stress the Indo-European side because that was kind of the militaristic, Uranic, properly Apollonian one of that dominated over other polytheistic systems that were instead much more Chthonic and Telluric, and were essentially the pre-Indo-European ones. But this is very important also because these peoples, by the way, all kind of fought for or against the Romans. It was a great competition. They made them a hybrid together with the same systemic values. Now, it is better than elsewhere in juridical uses that it's easy to grasp this long coexistence and also change that was never peaceful, and yet never denounced as such, like the ancient warrior values with the new Christian values, right? Because it's as if you study the history of the Romano-Germanic countries, more or less you realize that the church was always kind of the promoter of a, like, calm down, guys, let's try to be a bit more, constructive and peaceful and cooperative, and because you see, at this point, after all, in Western Europe, like, we depict the Dark Ages. In fact, it's dark, but it was a relatively peaceful time, right? The before the so-called Dark Ages and after the Dark Ages, there were many more wars than during the Dark Ages. So this was a moment in which, properly, even the presence of a metus of stilis would not favor more than much a political cohesion of these forces. I mean, think about the Franks, right? Think about the work of Gregory of Tours, and what the deal was. Clovis had made this gigantic achievement of essentially uniting the Franks, basically literally beheading all the the various chieftains that wouldn't obey, to essentially bond with the Gallo-Roman elites to create this enormous power that the Franks that had basically just come out of the forest would have never even thought of. And so that required a hell of a strength and of work, and that, in that sense, the motivation was in part also metus hostilis, because the Franks were surrounded by enemies in a sense, but also, of course, how much they could gain, right? But after that, the Merovingian dynasty broke down, and they were always fighting against each other, so the authors at that point couldn't but denounce this problem and the fact that there was still some kind of undisciplined dimension among this still essentially tribal mindset and all the ethical consequences of the same. I mean, Gregory of Tours denounces this constantly about the Frankish counts. He describes them as children fundamentally. They're always, incapable of, as emotional ones, incapable of, just remaining fixed on a base without killing anybody every once in a while, and repenting, but then doing the same thing anytime. There, of course, it's an ecclesiastical account, and it's probably not irrealistic at all, right? Because we know that those societies were incredibly violent and especially devoid of any conception of public authority in a sense. But probably this tumultuous reality did correspond to the necessities of the political and social reality, because, in fact, was there a state there left? Was there an actual monarchy that could control everything? Was there a central? Of course there wasn't, right? So the region would remain like that for centuries to come, in a way. But it was still better, than it could be like a tribal reality wherever the Franks had come from. So it was an extremely long, painful thing, but and that view of public authority that existed tried to discipline the situation, the community altogether, because how can you rule anywhere if you don't have a pacified situation, right? That's the first duty of every government, meant for fundamental. And you must at that point not prohibit force but discipline force, because communities are never devoid of a force on its own. A government cannot exist without the decisive support of the majority of the moral forces of the community. So this coexistence was in fact an intense struggle, actually, but from which no victory arose of the parties in conflict, but a synthesis, like war does as a hybrid, right? Perhaps the pure primeval Christian message suffered from this. There is no doubt. If you look at the Christian standards of these populations were appallingly low, if not non-existent sometimes. But only from this encounter and this comparison, let's say this confrontation between the gospel and new peoples and cultures, the Christianity that we know, and especially the one of the West, could be born, right? And today, historiography, in fact, has, let's say, got over the old controversies and has turned this renewed interest towards the study of, let's say, Germanic paganism, of course, and Christianity, from whose mutual influence a large part of European popular religiosity was born in the Middle centuries. As an example, let's take the case of customs such as the judicial duel. Here and elsewhere, we must follow kind of a chronological order, which roughly covers the whole space within which the great conversions of the Germanic peoples took place, right? So if we include the Norse, it's between the 4th and the 10th centuries, right? So this is a passage from Liutprand's laws in the early 8th century Italy. Quia incerti sumus de judicio Dei, et multos audivimus per pugnam sine justitia causam suam perdere, sed propter consuetudinem gentis nostre Langobardorum legem ipsam vetare non possumus. So this basically goes like for how we cannot accept God's judgment, and it has often been heard that many in battle have wrongly lost their rights. However, due to the deep-rooted tradition of this custom among our Longobard people, we cannot repeal such a law. Right. So this is a law in which the Longobard king Liutprand, that was at this point, you know, Liutprand was at the acme of the Longobard kingdom, right? They were fully Catholic by this point. They had quite an important economical development. They had a functional administration and so on. So Liutprand, as an enlightened king, was and a devoted one who was trying to reduce essentially the the custom of judicial duel, because in case you didn't notice, it doesn't sound like kind of a great idea in terms of justice. And however, there is certainly known, and he's basically saying that he was failing in that, you know, albeit being a powerful ruler and issuing many laws that were, we know, even in the practice, properly observed, he issued these laws. That is interesting because it's not much of a law. It's just basically saying I couldn't issue this law because we would have liked to limit judicial duel, but this is as a custom in such deeply rooted among our Longobard people that there's no way. There's a very famous passage in Germanic law. And however, there is certainly no need to draw catastrophic conclusions from this statement by Liutprand, because of course he was, you know, behaving like a pious Catholic. He didn't like this custom at all, for good reasons. But in reality, in his time, the custom of the judicial duel was already declining, replaced by the Roman Christian practice of arbitral judgment. So whenever you read an early medieval law, just know that it's never like kind of these kings had a control on everything that was happening in the country. Just there were certain specific cases that were brought to their palace, especially in this case where Longobard law actually worked pretty well, and so there was also a big deal of documentary evidence that we have differently from other areas of Europe that made some broader case, right, and for which the kings felt the need to. So these were usually kind of more important people than the average involved, etc. So we don't have to imagine that in 8th century Italy everything was settled by judicial duel, right? But there was still somebody who would make use of that, right? And we know because these duels were also regulated. If you read Rotary in the previous century, there is all this very fascinating laws issuing, for example, not to trick in judicial duels, not to use herbs, drugs, things like that, because they actually paid champions to fight in their stead. This is something that in many countries continued going on for a while. We've also made a video about the effigy of the Malvern Abbey Anonymous grave slab that was from the 13th century, if I'm not wrong. We see a guy who was probably a duel champion, made that for a living still. So legally it was something that went on for quite a while, but of course it was being surpassed, right? But what Liutprand actually means here as a king, right? So from the side of public force embodied, the use of the duel could not be eradicated with violence, right? It could be in fact abandoned, but not abolished by an act of dominion. This is crucial because here there were values that were going beyond not just the possibility of a king, but probably an ethos that had, we don't know here what Liutprand personally thought, right? He had politically to make this statement, but perhaps as a Longbard, he was, of the 8th century, still somewhat battled within, between the idea of, after all, why shouldn't God side with the good one? Of course, he would see many injustice happening still the same way, and you don't question what God really has in store for humanity in that sense. Justice also doesn't belong to this world, so it's just something in between, an idea that in the pagan world everything that happened to you was considered as you deserve it, for better or for worse, right? In actually not even in the Christian world you can argue that this wouldn't be the case if it happened, right? So the difference is not much. The only point is that when you have to govern a country, you also have to go a bit beyond the theory and see what the practice is about. So that was, why judicial duel was not a big deal. But still, there were some values behind this that were evidently expressed by this law. It was still felt at the time because they were resisting to an eventual monarchic regulation on this base. And this is also because of the idea of an immediate and imminent justice of God, which of course would have not granted strength if not to the just, and would have not tolerated the triumph of injustice. And it accorded not only with the ancestral traditions of the Germans, but also with the biblical image of the strong God, of God, Lord of battles, and revenge, right? Where's the wrath of God at some point? It's not just loving God. Neurocognitively, it doesn't make sense in any religion. Don't never fall into that lunacy because it's a bad heresy. It's a satanic anti-Christian idea in the first place. And it is fascinating because even if you think, here we are in the 8th century, if you look at Carolingian literature, in case you didn't notice, the Carolingians had quite a taste for war, given that basically was the only thing they ever did. And yet, of all the enormous amount of war that was made by the Carolingians, we have just one battle that we can reconstruct tactically, that is one of the few Carolingian defeats, by the way, the Battle of Zuntel, whereas all the other accounts, including the ones written by people who were part of those battles sometimes, because there were also abbots, that did that quite often, didn't care less to tell us how the battle was fought like. The most important thing was saying from which side God had stood for that side to have won. That's it. After all, what else do you need, right? It's somewhat it's a metaphysical idea that you can't quite calculate how it's going to go. If somebody won, there must have been a reason that stood in its moral force in a way or another. Not a moral force whether you were a good or bad person, but in how much you could put together, and in this sense also how much consensus and strength you obtain from a community for winning on that battlefield. And war was such a normal thing at the time that, of course, who cared? But did they care to let you know in the 21st century how they made war? But what was their point? They had much more important things to think about for themselves, including war. So which is an important political idea, by the way. So the Longobards, Alemannic, and Bavarian laws, for example, studied in parallel because they're similar, reveal a common tendency to limit the use of the ordeal that was constituted for the free by the judicial duel, and to associate it, perhaps as an alternative, to the oath, which was a way to say, okay, if you bring some witness that can essentially swear for you, and that's a big deal because it was done on the sacred, whichever sacred it was. So there was a public, at that point, and that reveals how important morality was in those days. This idea that if you had lied, you were basically, over, socially speaking. So it was just a way, an obvious way to say, okay, but why should we even fight at that point, right? Why do we have to shed blood, or just even if it were just for some dual champions that we just contracted for the occasion, right? It doesn't, it's not a... for example, the Longobard king Rotary stressed the equivalence of the two judicial proofs, that is, Judicium Dei and Sacramentum, with a clear aim of undermining the bloody evidence for the benefit of the bloodless, right? But at the same time, precisely to facilitate this operation, he was induced to pay homage to the Germanic traditions. In fact, to entice his people to prefer the oath, he allowed it to lend itself to the gospel or the sacred weapon, the arma sacrata, thus instituting a disturbing interchangeability between that and these. In other words, the gospel was equated to a sword. So the weapons entered the oath. Actually, they had always been there, also in the pagan tradition, but now they were accepted properly from a Christian authority as such. At the same time, as we see, for example, among the Alemanni, the invocation to God, the Creator, was preceded to the duel. So in this way, the ferocious traditions of the Germans, it is true, were attenuated. It is true, but the weapons, already protagonists in pagan oaths, entered alongside the gospel in a juridical formal fabric by now decidedly Christian. So this tells you how much of that. This is not much of compromising with a pagan custom. This is simply the idea that it's not a cultural thing. It's necessary. Every freeman at the time was armed and brought arms everywhere in church and had them blessed. How could you legislate differently? And especially for what reason? It didn't make any sense. And especially considering that already, whatever Roman or German power had existed at that point had been Christian and had an army with people that had never had the slightest moral problem with killing the enemies of the sacred, right? All the martyr saints of a geography, they were Roman legionnaires, but they weren't killed because they didn't want to kill people. There's not even a single hint at that in any existing source about that. What they cared about was not to sacrifice to a pagan, to the emperor, right? To a pagan cult. That's it. They were soldiers. They were doing their duty. Nobody hints at the fact that they didn't kill people. And why would they? We should thank God that we have a military that can kill our enemies. I mean, there cannot be a community without this. Of any kind. There wouldn't be any morality, there wouldn't be any responsibility, there wouldn't be any order, there wouldn't be any civilization without. But this introduction, at least in the Christian legal system, of properly sacred weapons in this even habitual practice, as you understand, was no small innovation. in early medieval Europe. So the proclaimed equivalence between arms and the gospel is a focal point for us concerning the Roman Christian methodology of acculturation towards Germanic paganism. I say Germanic by the way, but of course it was also Celtic, Slavic, and more around. So of course weapons, just because we're looking at Germanic laws now, of course weapons constituted for the warrior reassuring presence. Obviously enough, right? We made a video about, you know, the swords in the Germanic, the Irano-Germanic tradition, and we know what they meant. They had a supernatural meaning and identity and power, because they actually do. You can't cut people to pieces with that, right? And the certainty that Christianity perfected the ancient laws, and in the act in which it set them aside, did not, however, sanction their negative character at all. Thus, it was possible to become a Christian without denying or betraying the heritage of the fathers. And why would have they done in the first place? So beyond this, and you know, because we made videos about the Christian sacramentaries and the obvious realization that killing was a sin and that it required atonement and penance, everything that was still there, but it didn't have to do with blessing the sword per se. On the contrary, it actually rendered even more necessary, because it kind of, you know, motivated people to use them for a good purpose, fundamentally. And so, as today, right, our legal systems tell us that nothing about, you know, the righteousness of killing somebody. You know, if it is for self-defense, it's kind of okay, and it should be. So we're not actually talking about barbarians or anything. We're talking about the same reality in which we live. So beyond this powerful reason that justified acculturation, Christianity itself didn't even make a real concession to paganism by acting in this way, because, say, the renunciation of a warrior religion would have been difficult to justify if you pick the Old Testament. But not even. This other story, the Old Testament, is about violence and war and wrath. What do you think is in the New Testament? They're the same thing. The equivalence, with the Gospels is, think about Paul himself speaking of the sword of the Spirit. Let's leave aside the militia Christi. It's obvious that it's metaphorical. We made a video about that, but not quite, because actually the Gospels actually say nothing about the lack of violence per se. Christ was violent. Think about the temple. St. Peter cut off somebody's ear to defend Jesus. This is something that excited especially the Saxons when they were converted, especially because they were equating Jesus to a warband leader that would defend his chieftain for a warrior would defend his Peter is the warrior of the apostles as the retinue of Jesus. That's the idea, that would defend his Lord for everything. So that was an obvious message that you can't say, they were changing the meaning of the gospel, because the meaning of the gospel is frankly the same. Why was St. Peter's armed in the first place? What would have been strange about that for a Palestinian Jew of the first century AD, from a Germanic world, of the early Middle Ages? The world hadn't really changed that much, So, or think about the apocalypse for that matter, associating the symbols of the book and the sword, right? Justifying that swearing with within a common and coherent symbolic language, literally aut ad evangelia, aut ad arma. So, is there any ambiguity there? doesn't seem so, right? I guess just a modernistic problem to be confused about these things, because these things have an inherent universal moral and scientific logic that frankly cannot be altered minimally, and it's very refined, by the way. So from the idea that the gospel was a weapon to one that reciprocally a blessed weapon could take the place of the gospel, in fact the conceptual distance was immeasurable. Right, but the symbological step was short, and as always, the confusion between symbolizing and symbolize exists. So the tendency to associate, converge, synthesize Christian rites and symbols on the one hand and pagan rites and symbols on the other remained common. Right, it was not limited to the gospel and arms. Think about the menhirs used as support for the cross, the Fraubillenkreuz, and reciprocally, the large stone crosses similar to the menhirs, so typical of the Celtic landscape in Ireland and Brittany, are part of the same casuistic, let's say, which is very vast and nuanced, and that for long years is undistinguishable from paganism and Christianity in their ambivalent essence, right? They only gradually turned back towards the ancient gods and towards the ancestors stretched out under the cloth, yet at the same time reaching out towards the victorious young divinity, because Christianity was effectively winning over this other aspect. And this is why also the question was posed. A pagan doesn't have any other understanding legitimately than the stronger god wins, and thus really even monotheism has a different view. This must be explained in a way. Of course, for a pagan it's more a more concrete matter than, say, a theist sees the possibility of the world being taken over by evil forces at some point. That will actually happen, but so actually the pagan one did, as you know. So even here the differences were not so great, and so the capacity of understanding it, these Christian powers were taking over militarily, right? And if anything, because the most powerful countries at that point were Christian, had an important value, right? So among the Vikings, the antagonist of Christ, unsurprisingly, was the long popular warrior god Thor, and his hammer, the symbol that most stubbornly opposed the cross. But were they so different, right? In the struggle, in fact, the two divine adversaries would actually end up being united to resemble each other. And the clash between Thor and Christ became the image of a judicial duel itself, fatally recalling the fight attested by the Edda between Thor and another god from the south. Which was the god from the south? Odin. Odin was not a Scandinavian god. Odin was, properly imported in Scandinavia by the continental Germans that were more evolved and necessitated of a figure that was superior to a merely, heroic one. It had to go beyond in wisdom, in Wut. And who wins between Odin and Thor, right? And this difference is fascinating, because as Odin was coming from the south, from a Scandinavian perspective, so Christ was coming. And Odin was being equated to Christ, even among the continental Germans. So sometimes, and I don't need to explain why properly it was the much more, in fact, politically cohesive and militaristic range, let's say continental Germanic mythology, that kind of exported these models to Scandinavia, which was actually even more peaceful by certain standards, right? But in this sense, also much less militarized and much less ASIC, we could say, than what continental Germany was. And it's a bit the same reason why, I don't know, the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire had Christ until, the Germanic North tribes had paganism by a certain degree, right? It's the same dynamic, paradoxically. Because it corresponded simply to a larger scale of power that a more developed civilization could unleash in terms of authority, of discipline, of collective training, all these things. Now, sometimes, as in the rather late, though, Icelandic Njals saga, where at the end of the 13th century, one gets the impression that that man almost withdraws, acting as a spectator in front of the duel between Thor and Odin, waiting, according to the judicial custom, victory, indicating which side is the reason. And this is incredibly important because it shows that process of hierarchization of power. At this point, we're talking about, even in the Norse reality, of the existence of monarchies, of an order, of the armament of the masses, of the construction of more, powerful governmental structures, of military professionalism, feudalism, right? So something that now what would have been just the average tribal warrior would have been left ever more out from, just to look at, almost passively, or at least recognizing the inherent superiority of the two models clashing, and recognizing properly the outcome of the same as something greater than him. So a greater order was being recognized at much greater scale of political and social development. So meanwhile, in this fluid and uncertain world, in this alternation of frontal clashes and arbitrary but suggestive assimilations, compromise flourishes. Right, pagan mythological scenes are famously used to adorn Christian monuments in this time, according to a process that had already been seen in the Mediterranean world centuries before, and by some degree still going on at this time. But looking at the north, you can see the saga of Sigurd sculpted on the cross of the Church of St. Andrew on the Isle of Man. And near Gothenburg, carved on baptismal fonts, Gunnar in the snake pit perhaps plays a role similar to that elsewhere attributed to Daniel in the lion's den. And on the portal, roughly, we're talking about the early 12th century, of the Church of Illestad in Norway, Sigurd killing the dragon Fafnir has probably already assumed, as it is unlikely a purely ornamental function, the soteriological meaning of the great Christian Saurochthonus Michael. So, also, the objects of Christian worship found in pagan tombs play this same ambiguous and also disturbing role, because you may never know whether they're spoils of war, symbols of a unknown god, right, which, pagan perspective is still good to carry favor, right, for that, or it's either it's certificating of a personal secret devotion, right, pure hieroglyphs welcomed in the grace of their external similarity, external then to what extent, but with respect to pagan religious symbols such as the cross with respect to the various Nordic sacred symbols. Think about the swastikas, or and then after all, there were still solar symbols. Christ rises in the east. what are you going to do about that at the same time? It is a fact that the two antagonists, Christ and Thor, have very similar symbols. And it is a fact as well that there is evidently speculation in this similarity. The young male heroes winning over the forces of evil, after all, that there is a tendency not to differentiate cross and hammer, for example, at some point, to elaborate, but to elaborate similar stylized, almost dual-use iconographic types. So to ingratiate themselves with, one would think, the two powers at the same time. For example, at the Nationalmuseet in Copenhagen, there is a significant casting mold that belonged to a Jutland merchant, and this was capable of making crosses as well as Thor's hammers at the same time. So there is no doubt that, of course, there is an ambiguity here, because we must not just force like a multicultural idea that there is no difference or not a contradiction between these things, because of course these symbols were not devoid of let's say they weren't unloaded with particular political, social, cultural, moral meanings, right? Properly worldviews and so on. So it's a very confused framework, indeed, that between German paganism and Christianity. It couldn't be otherwise, because we know that any culture fundamentally reacts like this with one another. But we cannot still, and this is, should be a proof of humility, still properly grasp the truer hidden reason behind this coexistence. Like, we are not those men and of those times. There is, of course, a lot in common that we haven't and we can't understand, but let's say to what extent can we actually understand exactly what the meaning of a metal cross in a pagan tomb is, right? Because how can we see that symbol, like even within the grave of a warrior or a lady that wanted to have them put, wanted to have it with them, just as an ornament, let's say. It's not that different from the extent to the bronze statue of dancing Shiva that makes a fine show itself in a living room today, right? Does that attest any propensity of the landlord for Hinduism? And so this is quite important to bear in mind. But there are other aspects that can clarify this question. And we'll see in other videos that are quite important. We already seen in other circumstances. We'll keep updating. If you go in medieval Christianity playlist, say in the Germanic history playlist, you will find plenty of this. Maybe I'll create a playlist about the Christianization of Europe. Will be kind of more, kind of more useful for this. In any case, for today we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.